The badge hit the desk before anyone in the room understood why. Margaret Hale set it down the way a person sets down something they never wanted to touch in the first place. 2 fingers, a small distance kept between her hand and the plastic card with Elena Castillo's photograph on it. Elena did not move. She stood in the center of an open-plan floor of 40 people who had all, in the space of one heartbeat, stopped pretending to type. Margaret's voice carried the practiced calm of someone who had rehearsed this moment in a mirror. "Effective immediately," she said. "Security will escort you out." Elena reached for her badge, and Margaret pulled it back half an inch, as if it still belonged to her. As if any of it still belonged to her. Nobody in that room knew what was about to happen in the next 14 days. Nobody, including Margaret, who was about to walk back into her office, still believing she ran this company. She did not know that the woman she had just humiliated owned every desk in that building, every chair. The elevator Elena would take down to the lobby in less than a minute, the parking garage where her car waited untouched since 6 that morning, the building itself, its foundation, its name on the lease, all of it traced back to a single signature Elena had used exactly once, years earlier, and never again. Margaret had built her entire authority on a story she never bothered to confirm. She assumed power because no one had ever told her otherwise, and Elena had let her believe it, quietly, deliberately, for reasons that had nothing to do with weakness. In 14 days, Margaret Hale would stand in a boardroom and discover exactly whose name had been on every document she ever signed. She would understand, far too late, that the woman she fired for being too good at her job had been watching her the entire time. This is the story of how jealousy convinced one woman to destroy the only person who could have protected her, and how silence became the most expensive mistake she ever made. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To understand how this moment came to exist, we have to go back further than the firing itself. We have to ask 3 questions, because the answers to these 3 questions are the only thing that explains everything that happens next. Why did Margaret Hale want Elena Castillo gone so badly that she was willing to humiliate her in front of 40 witnesses? What did Margaret not know about the woman she was firing? A fact so basic and so obvious in hindsight that everyone who later heard this story asked the same question: how did nobody notice? And finally, what happens when a woman who has spent years deliberately invisible decides the moment has come to stop being invisible? Each of these questions has an answer. None of the answers are simple. What we know is this: Elena Castillo had worked at Hale Logistics Group for 6 years before that morning. She had been, by every internal measurement the company used, its most consistently high-performing operations director. She had also been, for almost the entire 6 years, the majority shareholder of the company itself, a fact known to exactly 4 people, none of whom worked anywhere near the building where she clocked in every morning at 7:15. The company had no idea who signed its existence into being. The company believed Margaret Hale had built it. Margaret believed this most of all. To understand why Margaret believed it so completely, we need to go back almost 20 years, long before Hale Logistics Group existed in its current form, to a smaller freight company in Ohio, where a young Margaret Hale started as a dispatcher, fresh out of a state college business program. She was good with people in those early years, genuinely good, before ambition curdled into something narrower. Colleagues from that period remember her as funny, generous with credit, the kind of coworker who remembered birthdays and covered shifts without being asked. Something in her changed slowly across the years that followed, not through any single event, but through an accumulation of near misses, promotions that went to other people, a merger that eliminated her department and forced her to start over twice in 1 decade. By the time Margaret reached her late 30s, she had developed a private theory about her own career that she rarely said aloud, but that governed nearly every decision she made afterward. She believed competence alone had never been enough for her, that something else, connections, timing, a willingness other people had that she lacked, determined who actually rose and who stayed treading water. There was truth buried inside that theory, the way there often is inside theories people use to explain their own disappointment. But Margaret never examined which parts were true and which parts were simply easier to believe than the alternative, that perhaps her own choices had played a larger role than luck ever had. There was one specific incident, during her 36th year, that Margaret rarely discussed, but that colleagues from that period still remembered clearly. A promotion she had spent 2 years actively positioning herself for went instead to a younger colleague named David Ferris, a decision the company justified through a restructuring rationale that Margaret, at the time, found genuinely difficult to dispute on its merits. David had simply built stronger relationships across departments, understood the company's shifting priorities more clearly, and presented his ideas with a confidence that came from actual preparation rather than performance. Margaret told herself afterward that David had been better positioned through circumstance rather than substance, a story that allowed her to avoid the harder, more useful question of what specifically she might have done differently to prepare herself as thoroughly as he had. She left that company within the year, telling friends and family she had outgrown its limited opportunities, a partial truth that obscured the fuller, more uncomfortable one, that she had grown unable to tolerate watching someone else succeed in a role she had convinced herself belonged to her by right. This pattern, leaving rather than examining, repeated itself once more before Hale Logistics, at a mid-sized freight brokerage, where a similar dynamic unfolded with a different colleague entirely, reinforcing in Margaret a belief she never fully articulated even to herself, that her own talent was somehow perpetually misunderstood by the people positioned to recognize it, rather than considering the simpler possibility that recognition typically follows substance rather than preceding it. The opportunity at Hale Logistics arrived almost by accident, through a former colleague who had moved into the company's growing executive layer and remembered Margaret as sharp, reliable, someone who could be trusted to execute a vision without needing to originate one. The board at the time was searching for a chief executive who projected confidence above all else, having just weathered a difficult transition after the previous leadership team's quiet, internal restructuring. Margaret interviewed twice, performed beautifully in both conversations, and was offered the role with a speed that flattered her, and which she would later, privately, never fully examine. She told herself she had earned it. She needed to believe that more than she needed to know whether it was true. The early Margaret Hale, the one who ran Hale Logistics in her first 18 months as chief executive, was not yet the woman who would one day fire Elena Castillo in front of 40 witnesses. She delegated reasonably well. She listened, on her better days, more than she spoke. The shift began slowly, the way most meaningful shifts in a person do, not with a single decision, but with 1,000 small moments, where she chose comfort over honesty, chose the version of events that protected her sense of having earned everything, over the version that might have required humility she had spent 2 decades trying to avoid needing. Elena Castillo's story began somewhere entirely different, in a small coastal town where her father, a man named Hector Castillo, had spent 30 years building a regional freight and logistics network from almost nothing, a single truck, and a handshake agreement with a produce distributor who needed reliable delivery more than he needed a formal contract. Hector was not a sentimental man in most areas of his life, but he was sentimental about one thing: the belief that businesses revealed their true character, not in how they treated customers or investors, but in how they treated the people who held no leverage over them, the newest hire, the quietest employee, the person nobody expected to matter. Elena grew up watching her father apply this belief with a consistency that shaped her more than any single lesson he ever spoke aloud. She remembered being 12 years old, sitting in the corner of her father's office during a school holiday, watching him fire a regional manager who had been publicly humiliating a young dispatcher for months, a decision that cost the company a significant contract because the manager's family had connections in the client's industry. Her father lost the contract and never once regretted the decision. He told Elena afterward, in the car on the way home, that money returns. Character does not. She carried that sentence with her for the rest of her life, long after she stopped consciously remembering where it came from. Hector restructured his company twice over the following decade, eventually folding it into a larger holding structure that would later become the parent entity controlling Hale Logistics Group itself. A corporate lineage so layered and indirect that almost nobody encountering the modern company would ever trace its ownership back to a single truck and a produce distributor's handshake. By the time Hector grew ill in his early 60s, the company had grown far beyond what he had originally built. Run day-to-day by professional management, while he retained controlling interest through the holding structure, a buffer he had constructed deliberately, the same way he had taught Elena to construct distance between who she truly was and what people assumed about her. Hector's illness arrived without much warning, a diagnosis that moved faster than anyone in the family expected. and during the final 18 months of his life, he spent considerable time preparing Elena, not for the business decisions themselves, which she already understood better than he sometimes gave her credit for, but for the psychological discipline the inheritance would require. He told her, during one of their last conversations, that the moment people learned what she owned, they would stop showing her who they really were. Wealth changes how people perform around you, he said. If you want to know who someone actually is, you have to let them believe, for as long as you can stand it, that you are nobody worth performing for. These final conversations took place mostly in the evenings, after Hector's strength had usually faded for the day, in a small study lined with photographs from the company's earliest years. A single truck parked outside a warehouse that no longer existed. Employees long since retired or passed away themselves. Faces Elena had grown up hearing stories about without ever meeting most of them. Hector spoke during these evenings with a clarity that seemed, to Elena, almost unrelated to the illness steadily working against him, as though some part of him understood that these conversations represented his last meaningful opportunity to transfer not just ownership, but an entire philosophy, one that had taken him 30 years to develop, and that he worried, privately, might not survive intact once filtered through someone else's experience. He told her once, during a particularly difficult evening near the end, that he had made his own version of Margaret's mistake earlier in his career, trusting a business partner's confidence without sufficiently testing the substance behind it, a decision that had cost him nearly everything in his 30s before he rebuilt more carefully, more slowly, the second time around. He rarely spoke about this period of his life, and Elena understood, hearing it for the first time so close to the end, that he was offering her something he considered more valuable than the company itself, the specific, hard-earned knowledge of exactly how costly it becomes when a person mistakes their own confidence for proof of their right to power over others. She promised him, during one of these final conversations, that she would not make the same mistake, a promise she would think about often during the years that followed, particularly during the 18 months she spent watching Margaret's resentment slowly build into something dangerous. Elena took this advice more literally than her father perhaps intended, structuring her inheritance through a trust that used her mother's maiden name, Reyes, on the controlling documents, a name disconnected enough from her public identity that virtually nobody who met her professionally would ever think to draw a line between the operations director named Elena Castillo and the controlling shareholder of record. She told herself in the early years that this was temporary, a transitional measure while she learned the business from the inside before stepping into a more visible role. The years accumulated instead. The arrangement that began as a transition became, gradually, a permanent way of moving through the world. She joined Hale Logistics specifically, rather than any number of other companies within the broader holding structure, because she wanted to understand the part of her father's legacy that had grown furthest from his direct hand, the entity now run entirely by professional executives who had never met him, who had no personal stake in honoring what he believed about character and leverage. She told the human resources team during her interview that she was drawn to logistics because of family experience in the industry, a true statement that revealed nothing, the kind of careful honesty her father had modeled for her, without ever quite calling it a skill. The early years at Hale Logistics gave Elena exactly the education she had hoped for, though not always the one she expected. She watched Margaret Hale closely from her very first weeks, not with suspicion initially, but with the same careful attention she brought to everyone in a position of authority. Margaret, in those early years, treated Elena with the ordinary, unremarkable respect a competent manager extends to a promising new hire, nothing especially warm, nothing especially cold. Elena's reviews praised her precision, her instinct for catching errors before they became expensive, and Margaret signed off on each positive review without apparent reservation, because at that point, Elena's competence had not yet become threatening. It would take nearly 4 years before that changed. The first person at Hale Logistics to become genuinely close to Elena, in the ordinary sense the rest of the office understood closeness, was a woman named Priya Anand, who joined the company 8 months after Elena did, hired into a junior coordinator role that would eventually grow into a full management position. Priya had immigrated to the United States from outside Mumbai 5 years earlier, building a career methodically, carefully, aware, in a way many of her American colleagues were not, of how quickly an immigrant professional's standing could be questioned over even minor missteps. She approached her work with a watchfulness that mirrored Elena's own, though for different reasons, and the two women recognized something familiar in each other almost immediately, without ever discussing it directly. Priya and Elena's friendship developed slowly across long days, and the particular intimacy that forms between people who solve problems together under pressure. Priya knew Elena better than almost anyone else at the company. Knew her habits, her dry sense of humor, that rarely surfaced in meetings, but emerged constantly in quiet one-on-one conversations, her tendency to work through lunch on days when a shipment problem nagged at her unsolved. What Priya did not know, for the entire 6 years of their friendship until the very end of this story, was the truth about what Elena actually owned. Elena trusted her completely in every other respect. This single omission was not personal distrust. It was discipline, the same discipline her father had taught her, applied even to the person she trusted most inside that building. Priya's own path to Hale Logistics had required a different kind of discipline entirely, one rooted in the specific calculations immigrant professionals often make, without ever fully discussing them aloud, even with close friends. She had left a stable, well-regarded position in Mumbai to follow her husband's own career opportunity to the United States, accepting, in the process, a temporary step backward in seniority that she absorbed quietly, telling herself it was a short-term sacrifice rather than a permanent diminishment. She rebuilt her standing at Hale Logistics methodically over several years, earning each promotion through visible, undeniable results, aware throughout that her margin for error remained narrower than it would have for many of her colleagues, a reality she rarely discussed but that shaped, quietly, almost every professional decision she made. This awareness made Priya particularly attuned to power dynamics that others on the operations floor sometimes missed entirely. The subtle difference between a manager's genuine feedback and a manager building a narrative, the specific tone certain executives used when speaking to people they considered expendable versus people they considered necessary. She recognized something familiar in Elena almost immediately upon meeting her, a similar watchfulness, though she would not understand for years exactly how differently their underlying circumstances actually were. Richard Voss entered this story earlier than most people realize, though his significance would not become clear until much later. Richard had served on the board of the holding company controlling Hale Logistics for nearly 15 years, by the time Margaret was hired as chief executive, a board member with a reputation for caution bordering on stubbornness, the kind of person younger executives sometimes found frustrating precisely because he refused to be impressed by confidence alone. Richard had known Hector Castillo personally, had sat across from him at dozens of meetings over 2 decades, and had been among the small handful of people informed when Hector restructured his estate to pass controlling interest to his daughter under the Reyes family name. Richard's relationship to this arrangement was simple and unwavering. He respected Hector's wishes completely, understood the reasoning behind Elena's chosen invisibility, and considered it entirely outside his role to ever hint at the truth to anyone, including the chief executives who rotated through leadership beneath the holding structure's quiet oversight. He watched Margaret's hiring process with the same caution he applied to every major decision, noted privately that her confidence in interviews exceeded the depth of her answers when pressed on specifics, and voted in favor of her hiring anyway, persuaded by colleagues who valued decisiveness over the slower, more careful leadership style Richard himself preferred. He would think about that vote often in the years that followed, long before he understood exactly how much it would eventually cost. Richard had come to his own caution honestly, through decades on boards, where he had watched talented executives derailed by leadership chosen for charisma rather than substance, and through a personal history he rarely discussed, but that had shaped him just as thoroughly as Hector's philosophy had shaped Elena. Early in his career, Richard had worked under an executive whose entire leadership style depended on never being challenged, a man who systematically pushed out anyone whose competence threatened his own carefully constructed image, until the company itself collapsed under the weight of decisions nobody had been allowed to question. Richard had survived that collapse with his career intact, but he carried the memory of it into every boardroom he ever sat in afterward, a quiet vigilance for the specific warning signs of insecurity, dressed up as confidence, the kind of vigilance that should have made Margaret's interview answers more concerning to him than they ultimately were. He sometimes wondered, in later years, whether his vote in favor of Margaret's hiring had been influenced by exhaustion rather than genuine conviction, a board search that had already run long, other candidates who had withdrawn for reasons unrelated to Hale Logistics, a growing pressure from his fellow board members to simply make a decision and move the company forward. He had let that pressure override an instinct he had trusted his entire career, and he understood, once the truth eventually surfaced, that this single lapse in his own discipline had cost Elena 18 months of unnecessary difficulty, a cost he took seriously, even though nobody, including Elena herself, ever asked him to. The 4 years between Elena's hiring and the beginning of real tension with Margaret passed in a way that, looking back, almost nobody at Hale Logistics found remarkable at the time. Elena built a reputation floor by floor, contract by contract, the kind of reputation built entirely on delivered results rather than visibility or self-promotion. She was promoted twice during those years, each time on the strength of work that spoke clearly enough that even a chief executive inclined to overlook her might have struggled to justify denying the promotion. Margaret approved both promotions without apparent hesitation, telling colleagues at the time that Elena represented exactly the kind of talent the company needed to retain. It would be easy to assume Margaret's later jealousy had been present from the beginning, simmering quietly under a calm exterior for years before finally surfacing. The truth is more uncomfortable than that, and more honest about how resentment actually grows in people who have spent their lives avoiding self-examination. Margaret's feelings toward Elena in those early years were not jealousy at all. They were something closer to relief, the relief an insecure leader feels when surrounded by competent people who make her own gaps less visible. Margaret's unraveling did not begin with Elena. It began with a series of small, unrelated failures of her own that Elena's continued success made impossible to ignore. The first of these came during Margaret's 3rd year as chief executive, when a major client relationship she had personally cultivated collapsed over a contract dispute that Margaret had mismanaged from the very beginning, ignoring early warning signs that a more careful executive would have caught. The loss was significant enough to require an explanation to the board, and Margaret, rather than acknowledging her own miscalculation, framed the collapse as an unavoidable market shift, a story the board accepted at the time without much scrutiny. Richard Voss did not entirely believe this framing, though he lacked the specific evidence to challenge it directly, and he made a note, mentally if not formally, that Margaret's instinct under pressure leaned toward narrative management rather than transparency. This pattern repeated itself twice more over the following 2 years, each time on a smaller scale, each time managed successfully enough that Margaret's position remained secure, but each time reinforcing a private anxiety she never spoke about openly to anyone. The growing fear that her early promotion into this role had outpaced her actual readiness for it, and that eventually, someone would notice the gap between her presentation and her substance. This fear did not make Margaret cruel by itself. Fear rarely does, on its own. What made the fear dangerous was what happened when it collided directly, for the first time, with undeniable proof of someone else's superior competence, delivered not as an attack, but as simple, unintentional contrast. That collision arrived during the contract renewal crisis we mentioned briefly before, 18 months before the firing, though the full story of that crisis deserves far more detail than a single summary can offer, because it represents the precise moment where Margaret's private insecurity transformed into something aimed directly, specifically, at Elena Castillo as an individual, rather than as an abstract source of unease. The client at the center of the contract renewal crisis was a mid-sized pharmaceutical distributor based in Phoenix, a relationship Hale Logistics had maintained for nearly a decade, and one Margaret personally considered among her proudest achievements, having helped negotiate the original agreement years earlier during her first months as chief executive. The renewal itself should have been routine, a formality requiring updated terms and minor adjustments to shipping volumes, the kind of process that rarely required executive attention at all. It became a crisis only because of an internal scheduling error 3 levels below Margaret's office, a junior analyst who had built the renewal proposal using outdated volume projections that no longer matched the client's actual needs. The error sat unnoticed for nearly 2 weeks, working its way slowly through approval layers until it landed, almost by chance, on Elena's desk for a routine secondary review, the Friday before the contract's scheduled signing. Elena noticed the discrepancy within minutes, the kind of detail that required not just attention, but genuine understanding of how the client's business had evolved over the preceding year. Knowledge Elena had absorbed gradually, through months of unglamorous, careful relationship maintenance that nobody above her had ever specifically asked her to do. She recognized immediately that signing the contract as written would damage the relationship within months, once the client discovered the volume terms no longer reflected their actual operations. It was 11 at night on a Friday when Elena made the decision that would, 18 months later, become the spark for everything that followed. She could have flagged the error and waited until Monday, technically fulfilling her responsibilities without taking on unnecessary risk. Instead, she stayed at her desk alone, rebuilding the entire shipping schedule from scratch, using current data she had to source herself from 3 separate internal systems that did not communicate well with each other. Work that took her past 2 in the morning and that nobody had asked her to do. Work that existed entirely because Elena had internalized, somewhere along the way, her father's belief that competence, which only shows up when convenient, is not really competence at all. The office had emptied out hours earlier by the time Elena settled into the work in earnest. The building's overnight cleaning crew, moving quietly through the floors below, the kind of silence that exists only in commercial buildings after the ordinary workday has ended, broken occasionally by the distant hum of an elevator carrying nobody in particular. Elena had experienced this specific kind of solitary, focused labor many times before, and she found, as she often did, that the absence of observers made the work easier rather than harder, free of the subtle performance that daytime hours in a shared office space inevitably required even from people who were not consciously performing. She called the client's logistics coordinator once during this process, near midnight, apologizing for the late hour, but needing clarification on a shipping volume figure that seemed inconsistent with data she had pulled from an earlier quarter. The coordinator, a woman who would later become one of the relationship's strongest advocates within her own organization, answered on the second ring despite the hour, impressed enough by Elena's evident diligence that she mentioned the call, weeks later, to her own supervisor as an example of exactly the kind of partner attentiveness that made the relationship worth maintaining. Neither woman knew, during that brief midnight phone call, how significant this small moment of mutual professionalism would eventually become to the larger story unfolding around it. She sent the corrected proposal to the client's procurement team early Saturday morning, along with a brief, professional note explaining the adjustment without assigning blame to anyone internally, a choice that mattered more than Elena herself initially realized. The client's lead negotiator, a woman who had grown frustrated with smaller inconsistencies in the relationship over recent months, responded within hours with visible relief, and the contract was signed Monday morning, on terms that actually reflected the partnership's real trajectory, securing a relationship worth, over its renewed term, more than Margaret's entire annual compensation package combined. The client's praise arrived in an email sent late Monday afternoon, warm and specific, naming Elena directly multiple times, describing her diligence as exactly the kind of partnership the client valued enough to recommend Hale Logistics to 2 other companies within their own industry network. The email was meant for an internal distribution list within the client's own organization, copying a Hale Logistics account manager for visibility, but a configuration error in the client's email system accidentally included several additional recipients, among them Margaret Hale, who read the message standing in her own kitchen at 6 the following morning, coffee untouched, the email open on her phone for considerably longer than its length actually required to read. What Margaret felt reading that email was not, in the most literal sense, jealousy of Elena specifically. It was something more disorienting, a sudden and complete recognition of the precise size of the gap between the executive she presented herself as and the executive she actually was. The client's praise for Elena was not exaggerated. It was simply plainly true. True in a way Margaret's own contributions to the relationship, the parts she had always privately credited herself for, had clearly never been. She understood, in that kitchen, at 6 in the morning, that if the client had been forced to choose between keeping Margaret or keeping Elena, the choice would not have been close. Margaret did not confront this feeling directly. She did what she had trained herself to do across 2 decades of avoiding self-examination whenever it threatened to surface. She converted the discomfort into a story about Elena, instead of a story about herself. A slow, almost unconscious process at first, the mind's quiet preference for blaming the mirror rather than the reflection. Within weeks, Margaret began noticing things about Elena she had never paid attention to before. The confident way she spoke in meetings, the ease with which colleagues deferred to her technical judgment, details that had existed unchanged for years, but that Margaret now experienced as personally directed at her, evidence of a threat rather than simply evidence of competence. The meeting notes began changing first, subtly, in ways that took Priya Anand nearly 2 months to consciously register as a pattern rather than isolated incidents. a disagreement Elena raised about an unrealistic timeline, framed in the official notes afterward as resistance to leadership direction. A request for an additional week on a project whose original deadline had been set without consulting the team actually responsible for the work, framed as a failure to meet commitments. None of these characterizations were technically false in the narrowest sense. The words used were defensible if read in isolation, but together, they built a portrait of Elena that bore almost no resemblance to the woman Priya had worked alongside for years. Priya raised a small concern about this pattern once, carefully, during a one-on-one conversation with Margaret roughly a year before the firing, phrasing her observation as a question rather than a challenge, asking whether the framing in recent project reviews felt slightly harsher than the situations themselves seemed to warrant. Margaret's response was warm on its surface and unmistakably final underneath, thanking Priya for her perspective while making clear, through tone rather than explicit words, that the conversation was finished. Priya left that meeting with a specific, uncomfortable clarity she would carry for the following year, the understanding that she had seen something true and had been gently, effectively, discouraged from saying it again. This single conversation became, in hindsight, the moment Priya's complicity in this story truly began, though calling it complicity feels almost unfair to the genuine fear that produced it. Priya was, at that point in her career, 2 years away from a green card application that depended significantly on stable, uninterrupted employment and a strong professional reference from her current employer. She told herself, in the months that followed, that staying quiet was not cowardice, but pragmatism, a calculated decision to protect her own security until she had the standing to risk it. She was not entirely wrong to feel this calculation mattered. She would spend a long time afterward, once the full story became clear, deciding how much of that calculation had actually been necessary and how much had simply been fear dressed up as strategy. Richard Voss, meanwhile, began noticing his own version of the pattern from a greater distance, through quarterly reports and Margaret's increasingly defensive tone during board calls whenever questions touched on operational performance. He did not yet understand the specific dynamic between Margaret and Elena, having no visibility into day-to-day office relationships from his position on the board, but he understood Margaret well enough by then to recognize the texture of someone managing a story rather than managing a business. He raised a question once, mildly, during a quarterly review, about why operational performance metrics consistently outpaced the confidence Margaret projected about the team responsible for them, a question Margaret deflected smoothly enough that the board moved on without further scrutiny. Richard did not forget the deflection. He simply filed it away, the way he filed away most things, waiting to see whether a pattern would eventually become undeniable. The 18 months between the contract renewal incident and the firing itself were, for Elena, a period of growing, deliberate clarity rather than confusion. She understood exactly what was happening to her, had understood it almost from the beginning, because she had spent her entire adult life trained by her father to recognize precisely this kind of slow erosion in how powerful people treat those they have decided, consciously or not, represent a threat to their own story. What she did not yet know was when, or whether, she would need to do anything about it. Her father's voice stayed with her constantly during this period, the same advice repeating itself. Let people show you completely who they are before you decide what to do about it. There were moments during those 18 months when Elena considered ending the situation early, simply revealing the truth about her ownership in a quiet, private conversation that might have spared everyone, including Margaret, the public reckoning that eventually followed. She raised this possibility once with herself seriously, during a particularly difficult week, when Margaret excluded her from a planning meeting that directly concerned projects Elena had been managing for over a year. She decided against it, not out of cruelty, but because she recognized something her father had taught her to recognize in herself as much as in others, that an early, private revelation would protect Margaret from consequence without actually correcting anything, would simply teach Margaret that cruelty carries no real cost as long as the target eventually proves valuable enough to spare. 3 weeks before the firing, Margaret began assembling what she would describe to the board afterward as a documented performance concern, a phrase that implied far more rigor and fairness than the actual process contained. She pulled 2 junior managers into private conversations, framing her concerns as protecting team morale and organizational standards, careful never to use language extreme enough that either manager might push back directly. One of these managers was new enough to the company that he had no real basis for independent judgment about Elena's actual performance and simply trusted Margaret's framing without question. The other was Priya Anand. Priya's second private conversation with Margaret during this 3-week window was harder than the first had been a year earlier, because by this point, the gap between what Margaret was describing and what Priya actually knew to be true had grown too large to rationalize away easily. Margaret used the phrase "too confident for her role" during this conversation, a phrase that lodged itself uncomfortably in Priya's mind precisely because it revealed something about Margaret rather than about Elena, an admission, unintentional and unguarded, that the real complaint had never been about performance at all. Priya said nothing in response beyond a quiet acknowledgement. She would replay that silence countless times in the months ahead, long after the truth about Elena had reshaped how she understood every conversation she had ever had with Margaret about her. The final week unfolded with the quiet, procedural momentum of something already decided, long before its official announcement. Margaret scheduled the meeting 2 days in advance, deliberately vague in its calendar description, performance discussion, language designed to keep its target compliant rather than prepared. A small cruelty buried inside ordinary corporate procedure. Elena received the invitation on a Tuesday afternoon and read it twice before closing her laptop screen, understanding immediately and completely what it meant. The culmination of 18 months she had watched arrive with the same careful attention she brought to everything else in her professional life. She did not call a lawyer. She did not reach out to Richard Voss or to any of the small handful of people who knew the truth about her ownership. She made instead the same decision she had been quietly preparing herself to make for longer than she would later admit even to herself, a decision rooted entirely in her father's philosophy rather than in any desire for spectacle. She would let it happen exactly as Margaret intended, in front of as many witnesses as possible, because some lessons, the kind that actually change how an organization understands itself, only land when they are learned publicly, in front of the very people who will go on to decide, collectively, what kind of culture they want to work inside afterward. The morning of the firing began like any other morning at Hale Logistics. Elena arrived at 7:15, the same time she always arrived, ordered her coffee from the same cart outside the building, exchanged the same brief nod with the security guard, who had known her longer than almost anyone else who worked there. Nobody watching her walk to her desk would have guessed that she already knew what the day held. She opened her laptop, reviewed 3 shipping contracts, answered an email from a client in Phoenix, behaved, in every visible way, like a woman with no idea that her career was about to end in front of an audience. Priya noticed something different that morning, though she could not have said exactly what. Elena seemed, if anything, slightly calmer than usual. A stillness that Priya would later understand had nothing to do with calm at all, but with the particular composure of someone who has already made peace with what is coming. Priya herself had not slept well the previous 2 nights, carrying a low, constant unease she could not fully name, the kind of feeling that arrives before a person consciously understands what they are afraid of. At 10:40, Margaret walked onto the operations floor with 2 people from Human Resources trailing slightly behind her, the universal signal that something irreversible was about to happen. She did not call Elena into a private office. This detail mattered more than anyone in that room initially understood. Margaret wanted witnesses. She wanted the floor to see exactly what happens to people who make her feel smaller than she believed herself to be, and she had convinced herself, in the days leading up to this moment, that watching it happen publicly would finally settle something that had been gnawing at her for 18 months. What Margaret said next would be repeated for years afterward by everyone who stood on that floor, repeated with the specific clarity that only comes from witnessing something you sense, even in the moment, you will need to describe accurately later. She accused Elena of undermining leadership. She used the phrase repeated pattern of insubordination, a phrase someone had clearly coached her to use, though Margaret delivered it as though the words were entirely her own. She said the company needed stability, and stability required removing sources of friction. And then, in the sentence that would become infamous among the people who heard it, she said, "I built this company, and I will not let anyone forget who is actually in charge here." The room went still in a way. Rooms rarely go still. 40 people who had spent 6 years watching Elena Castillo solve problems quietly, who had no idea what she actually owned but understood, on some instinctive level, that something about this accusation did not fit the woman they knew, said nothing. This is the part of the story that troubles people most when they hear it for the first time. Not that Margaret lied. People lie under pressure constantly. What troubles people is how easily an entire room of adults, professionals, allowed a lie to stand uncontested, simply because the person telling it held a title. Elena listened to all of it without interrupting. She did not defend herself. She did not raise her voice. When Margaret finished speaking and extended her hand for the badge, Elena removed it from around her neck slowly, set it on the desk herself rather than handing it over, and said only 4 words before she turned to leave. "You'll understand soon enough." Nobody in that room, including Margaret, understood what those 4 words meant. Margaret would replay them constantly over the following 2 weeks, turning them over the way a person turns over a splinter they cannot quite locate beneath the skin, certain they meant something, unable to name what. The walk to the elevator took 90 seconds. Elena would later describe those 90 seconds as the longest of her professional life, not because she feared what was coming, but because of the particular silence of 40 people watching her leave a building she owned, none of them aware of the irony unfolding in front of them. The elevator doors closed. The floor exhaled. Collectively, the specific relief people feel when a conflict ends, even when they suspect, somewhere beneath the relief, that the conflict was never actually resolved, only postponed. Priya did not exhale with the rest of the room. She sat at her desk for nearly 20 minutes afterward, unable to focus on anything in front of her, replaying the sentence Margaret had used, "I built this company," a sentence Priya knew, in some quiet, half-formed way, was not entirely true, though she could not have said in that moment exactly why it felt false. She would think back on this feeling many times in the weeks ahead, trying to understand whether some part of her had sensed the truth long before she actually learned it. Margaret returned to her office that afternoon and felt, for the first time in 18 months, something close to peace. She told herself the decision had been necessary, framed it internally as protecting the company, rather than protecting her own fragile sense of authority. She called her sister that evening, something she rarely did during busy weeks, and described the firing in terms that made it sound less like an act of personal insecurity and more like a difficult but responsible leadership decision. Her sister, who had heard variations of this story before across the years, listened without much comment, the particular quiet of a family member who has learned not to challenge a narrative too directly. What Margaret did not know, as she sat in her office that evening, allowing herself this brief false peace, was that 2 floors above her, in a legal department she rarely visited, a scheduled compliance disclosure had already been filed weeks earlier, the kind of routine paperwork required whenever a holding company's beneficial ownership needed periodic verification under standard regulatory practice. She did not know the disclosure named, in plain legal language, the actual controlling shareholder of Hale Logistics Group. She did not know the document was scheduled to reach the full board in exactly 14 days, a timeline that had nothing to do with Elena's firing and everything to do with an unrelated filing deadline that had simply, coincidentally, arrived at the worst possible moment for Margaret's peace of mind. The first sign that something had shifted came 6 days after the firing, when Margaret received a call from the company's outside counsel requesting an unusual meeting, described only as a compliance matter requiring board attention. Margaret assumed, reasonably enough by her own logic, that this concerned a tax filing or a routine audit, the kind of administrative matter that crossed her desk periodically without much consequence. She spent the following days distracted by smaller fires instead, a missed shipment, an unhappy client, the ordinary friction of running a company without the operations director, who had quietly prevented friction like this for 6 years. She did not yet connect the absence of Elena Castillo to the sudden increase in operational chaos. She would later admit she should have. Priya Anand began noticing this absence in ways that troubled her more each day. Without Elena's quiet corrections operating constantly in the background, small errors that had never surfaced before began surfacing now with uncomfortable regularity. Shipment schedules built on outdated client data, contract renewals nobody had thought to double-check, the invisible scaffolding Elena had maintained for years simply gone, revealing, by its absence, exactly how much weight it had been holding up the entire time. Priya mentioned this once to a colleague in the break room, only to be told quickly to keep her voice down, a small moment that confirmed, more than anything else that week, that fear rather than loyalty had become the operations floor's dominant emotion. 9 days after the firing, the board received the disclosure document Margaret did not yet know existed. It listed, in language no different from any other compliance filing, the legal name attached to the controlling shares of Hale Logistics Group, the Reyes family name Elena's mother had carried, connected through a paper trail 4 board members had always known about, and never had reason to mention publicly, since the entire arrangement had been built around precisely this kind of quiet discretion. Richard Voss, reading the document for what was technically a routine verification, felt something different this time, a specific, uncomfortable recognition that the timing of this filing, arriving so soon after a firing he had heard about, only secondhand through an unrelated operations update, could not remain a coincidence much longer. Richard made a single phone call that afternoon. Scheduling an emergency board session, he insisted Margaret attend without explaining why. A decision he made carefully, deliberately, because he understood, perhaps better than anyone else on that board, exactly how significant this convergence of facts was about to become. He spent the 2 days before that meeting in a state of quiet, internal conflict he rarely allowed himself, caught between his long-standing respect for Hector Castillo's wishes and his growing certainty that Margaret was about to learn, in the most painful way possible, exactly how badly she had misjudged the woman she had humiliated in front of 40 witnesses. Margaret arrived at that boardroom 11 days after the firing, wearing the same composed expression she had worn while dismissing Elena, certain this would be another routine fire to manage, another moment where her authority would be tested, and would, as it always had before, hold. She sat at the head of the table the way she always sat, the position itself a kind of armor she had worn for years. She did not notice, at first, that Richard Voss would not quite meet her eyes. She did not notice that the room felt different, heavier, in a way she could not immediately name, though she would later remember this heaviness clearly, the way a person remembers the strange stillness of air before a storm they did not yet know was coming. Richard placed the disclosure document in front of her without much preamble, simply turned it so the relevant page faced her direction, his voice carefully neutral, in a way Margaret would only understand the significance of much later. Margaret read the name at the top, a name she did not initially recognize, because she had never once, in 6 years, asked Elena Castillo what her mother's maiden name had been, had never had reason to wonder about the personal history of a woman she had spent 18 months convincing herself was a problem to be managed, rather than a person worth understanding. It took her nearly a full minute to understand what she was looking at. The controlling shareholder of record, the legal name cross-referenced 2 paragraphs later, with an employment record she did recognize immediately, because it was the same employment record she had personally terminated 11 days earlier. The silence in that boardroom matched, almost exactly, the silence on the operations floor 11 days before, except this time, Margaret was the one standing in the center of it, the one whose entire understanding of her own position had just been quietly, irreversibly rewritten by a single line of legal text. She read the document a 3rd time, searching for an error that was not there, the way people search for errors in news they cannot yet bring themselves to accept as fact, hoping that careful reading alone might somehow change what the words plainly said. Richard Voss spoke first, his voice quiet in the specific way people speak when they are choosing every word with unusual care, aware that whatever he said next would be remembered precisely, repeated later, examined for every possible implication. He told her that Elena Castillo had held controlling interest in the company, since before Margaret had ever been promoted into her role. Years before, in fact, structured through a trust her father had established specifically to protect both the company's stability and Elena's own ability to move through the organization without the distortions that visible ownership tends to create in how people behave around someone they know holds real power over their careers. He told her the board had known, all along, every member who had served long enough to have been present when the arrangement was first established, and that this knowledge had never been kept from Margaret out of malice or strategy, but simply because Hector Castillo's wishes, honored faithfully by every board member who respected him, had never required disclosure to anyone outside a small, deliberately limited circle. He told her, in the gentlest phrasing he could manage, that the woman she had fired in front of 40 witnesses for being too confident in her role had, technically, every right to that confidence the entire time, had in fact shown remarkable restraint in never once exercising the authority that confidence could have justified. Margaret did not speak for nearly 30 seconds, an eternity in a room full of people watching her, watching the specific unraveling of a story she had told herself and everyone around her for years, the story of a woman who had built something through grit alone, a story that had just been revealed, in the cruelest possible way, to rest on assumptions she had never once thought to verify. When she finally found words, the first thing she said was a question, quiet, almost childlike in its disbelief, stripped entirely of the composed authority she had carried into every difficult conversation of her career. She asked why nobody had told her. Richard's answer would become, among the people who later learned this story, the line most often repeated, the sentence that seemed to capture something larger than the specific situation it addressed. He told her it was never the board's responsibility to protect her from a truth she could have learned simply by treating every employee as though they might matter more than her assumptions about them. He told her that the company's culture, the one she had presided over for years, had been built on a foundation that rewarded confidence over curiosity, certainty over the harder, more uncomfortable work of actually understanding the people she worked alongside every day. Margaret had no answer to that. There wasn't one, she asked, eventually, in a voice that had lost most of its earlier composure. What would happen now? Whether the board intended to remove her immediately, whether this meeting represented the end of everything she had spent years building, however shaky that foundation had just proven to be. Richard told her, honestly, that the decision was no longer entirely the board's to make, that Elena had requested, through her own legal counsel, a single meeting with the full board scheduled for exactly 14 days after the firing, a date that, Richard pointed out quietly, Margaret herself had unknowingly been counting down without ever realizing a clock was running. Margaret spent the 3 days between that boardroom meeting and Elena's scheduled return in a state she would later describe, to almost no one, as the most disorienting period of her adult life. She did not sleep well. She found herself replaying not just the firing itself, but years of small moments she had never previously examined. Conversations where Elena's calm had felt, in hindsight, less like the calm of someone simply doing her job, and more like the calm of someone who had always known something Margaret did not, who had been quietly, patiently waiting for a moment that had finally arrived. She called her sister again during this period, and for the first time in years, found herself unable to construct a version of events that made her own behavior sound reasonable. She considered, during one particularly difficult evening, reaching out to Elena directly, attempting some kind of preemptive apology before the board meeting could formalize whatever consequence was coming. She drafted a message on her phone twice and deleted it twice, paralyzed by the specific fear of saying the wrong thing to a woman whose actual power over her she had only just begun to understand. She ultimately sent nothing, a decision that would later strike her as one final, small failure of courage, layered on top of everything else. Though by that point the list of things she wished she had done differently had grown long enough that one more item barely registered. During those same 3 days, Margaret found herself returning, almost against her will, to memories of her own early career, the version of herself that colleagues from Ohio still remembered as generous and funny, the woman who covered shifts without being asked, and remembered birthdays without needing reminders. She wondered, lying awake at 2 a.m. on the second night, exactly when that version of herself had gone quiet, and whether the woman who had stood on the operations floor 11 days earlier, telling 40 people she had built this company alone, would have even recognized her younger self, or whether the distance between them had grown too wide to measure honestly. She did not arrive at a satisfying answer. She arrived only at the uncomfortable certainty that the answer mattered more than she had ever previously allowed herself to consider. The meeting took place in the same boardroom where Margaret had learned the truth 3 days earlier, the room rearranged slightly, chairs adjusted, though Margaret would later insist she could not have said exactly what had changed, only that the room felt different again, charged with an anticipation that had nothing to do with furniture. Elena arrived not as the operations director the company had known for 6 years, but in a role nobody on that floor had ever seen her occupy, the controlling owner, addressing the people who managed her own company on her behalf. She wore the same composed expression she had worn while being fired, the expression that had once been mistaken for weakness, and was now, finally, understood for what it actually was. She did not raise her voice during that meeting. She did not need to. She began by acknowledging the board members individually, including Richard Voss, whose long, quiet loyalty to her father's wishes she thanked specifically and sincerely, an acknowledgement that visibly affected him more than he expected it to. She then turned to the substance of why she had requested this meeting, speaking in language as measured and precise as the disclosure document itself had been, language that made clear she had spent the preceding 14 days thinking carefully about exactly what she wanted to say and what she did not. She told the board that she had spent 6 years watching how the company treated people who appeared to hold no power, because her father had taught her that this is where character reveals itself most honestly, in the unobserved moments rather than the performed ones. She said Margaret had revealed hers completely, in front of 40 witnesses, on a morning Margaret believed would end quietly, with one employee's career, and nothing else. She said the company's culture had allowed fear to operate as a management strategy for far too long, citing, without naming anyone directly beyond Margaret herself, the pattern of quiet intimidation that had clearly shaped how certain managers had felt unable to speak honestly about what they observed. The board asked Elena what she intended to do regarding Margaret's position, a question several members asked with poorly concealed anticipation, expecting, reasonably enough given everything that had happened, a swift and symmetrical reversal, the kind of ending that would have satisfied anyone watching from the operations floor who had spent 11 days waiting for justice shaped like revenge. Elena did not give them that ending, and the room's reaction to her refusal told its own story about how many people in that building had quietly hoped, perhaps without fully admitting it to themselves, to witness Margaret experience exactly the humiliation she had inflicted. Elena told the board she had no interest in firing Margaret the way Margaret had fired her, publicly, without warning, designed to humiliate rather than correct. She said that particular cruelty belonged to Margaret alone, and she refused to inherit it, refused to let this story become one more example of power, simply changing hands, while the underlying culture that had produced the cruelty remained completely unexamined. She said something during this part of the meeting that Richard Voss would remember clearly for years afterward, that revenge teaches an organization nothing except who currently holds the upper hand, while accountability, done carefully, teaches an organization what it actually values. Instead, Elena proposed something the board had not anticipated, a restructuring that would remove Margaret from the chief executive role entirely while keeping her employed in a significantly reduced capacity, a position with no authority over hiring, firing, or performance reviews, a position designed specifically to let Margaret continue working inside the company she once believed she controlled, now reporting to people she had previously dismissed as beneath her notice. Elena called this accountability without spectacle. Others on the board called it, privately, in conversations that happened only after Elena had left the room, the most precise punishment they had ever witnessed, because Margaret would now spend every working day watching the company thrive under leadership she had once tried to destroy, a daily, ongoing consequence far more enduring than any single dramatic confrontation could have produced. Priya Anand learned the full truth shortly after this meeting concluded, called into a private conversation with Elena that Priya would later describe as one of the most difficult and clarifying conversations of her professional life. Elena did not approach the conversation as a confrontation. She told Priya plainly that she understood the position Priya had been in, the genuine fear that had shaped her silence, and that she held no anger toward her for it, though she also did not pretend the silence had been costless, for Elena or for the broader culture it had allowed to continue unchallenged. Priya cried during part of that conversation, not entirely from guilt, but from the specific relief of finally understanding a pattern that had confused and troubled her for 18 months without ever quite resolving into something she could name. Margaret was informed of the board's decision, not in a public meeting, not in front of 40 witnesses, but in a private conversation with Elena herself, a choice Elena made deliberately, because she had decided early on, long before this meeting ever took place, that she would not become a mirror of the person who hurt her. The two women met in a small conference room on a floor, neither of them used often, away from the operations floor where the original firing had taken place, away from the boardroom where Margaret had first learned the truth. Margaret arrived first, sitting with her hands folded in front of her, a posture so unlike the composed authority she had carried for years, that Elena noticed it immediately upon entering. Elena began the conversation simply, without preamble, telling Margaret that she had watched her for 6 years and had seen, underneath the insecurity and the cruelty, a woman who genuinely believed competence was a finite resource, something that had to be defended rather than shared, something that diminished the more it was distributed among other people. She told Margaret this belief had cost her everything that mattered, not because Elena had taken it from her, but because the belief itself had quietly poisoned every relationship Margaret might otherwise have built with the talented people around her, had turned potential allies into perceived threats, had made genuine collaboration feel, to Margaret, like a kind of danger rather than a source of strength. Margaret listened to this without interrupting, something Elena noticed and would mention later as the first moment she felt genuinely uncertain about how this conversation might end, because the Margaret she had watched for years rarely allowed silence to sit unfilled, rarely let another person's assessment of her stand unanswered. When Margaret finally spoke, her voice carried none of the defensiveness Elena had expected, only a kind of exhausted honesty that suggested the preceding days had stripped away whatever capacity for self-protection she had relied on for most of her adult life. She asked Elena why she had never said anything, never revealed the truth earlier, when a single sentence at almost any point over the preceding 18 months could have ended the entire situation before it reached this point. Elena considered the question carefully before answering, because she understood it deserved an honest answer rather than a rehearsed one. She told Margaret that revealing the truth earlier would have protected Margaret from the natural consequences of her own choices, would have taught her, just as clearly as silence eventually did, that her behavior toward people she perceived as having no power over her would always, eventually, be excused once the stakes became personally inconvenient enough. She told Margaret that her father had spent 30 years building a company around the principle that character shows itself most honestly in unobserved moments, and that intervening early would have denied both of them the chance to learn what those moments actually revealed. She told Margaret, too, that the restructuring the board had approved was not designed as punishment in the way Margaret might be tempted to understand it, not a cage built from spite, but an opportunity, however uncomfortable, to learn something Margaret had never previously been forced to confront, what it actually felt like to work without the protective armor of unquestioned authority, to contribute to something without being able to claim ownership over its success. She said this might be the only path remaining that could teach Margaret something true about herself, since every previous chapter of her career had allowed her to avoid that particular lesson entirely. Margaret's first months in her reduced role were, by every account from people who worked near her during this period, genuinely difficult, in ways that went beyond simple professional discomfort. She had spent years occupying a position where her judgment went largely unquestioned, where meetings organized themselves around her presence, where her presence in a room shifted the room's entire dynamic without her needing to say anything at all. The new role offered none of this. She reported now to a director 2 levels below her former position, attended meetings where her input was welcomed but no longer assumed to carry special weight, and found herself, for the first time in over a decade, having to earn the attention of colleagues rather than simply receiving it by default. There were days during this period when Margaret considered resigning immediately, unable to tolerate the daily, accumulating evidence of how much her previous authority had depended on title rather than substance. She stayed, initially, for practical reasons, a need for stable income while she considered her next steps, but something else kept her there longer than pure practicality required. A stubborn, uncomfortable curiosity about whether Elena's theory about her might actually prove true, whether she was capable of contributing something real once stripped of the protective distance her former position had always provided. The honest answer, based on what people who worked alongside her during this period observed, was complicated. Margaret did show, gradually, occasional flashes of the genuine capability that had presumably justified her hiring all those years earlier, moments where her experience proved useful to a team navigating an unfamiliar problem, moments where she offered a perspective that actually improved an outcome rather than simply asserting authority over one. These moments were real, and people who witnessed them sometimes wondered, quietly, whether a different Margaret might have existed all along, buried beneath 2 decades of insecurity that had never been given a reason to recede. But the moments remained occasional rather than consistent, and Margaret struggled, in ways that became increasingly visible to colleagues over the following year, with the daily psychological weight of her reduced circumstances, particularly the unavoidable proximity to Elena's continued, quiet success. She watched Elena return to her former role as operations director within a month of the boardroom meeting, watched the company's performance metrics improve steadily under leadership that nobody now needed to be told held genuine authority, watched colleagues who had once deferred to Margaret out of positional respect begin deferring to Elena out of something closer to genuine trust, the kind that accumulates slowly and cannot be manufactured through title alone. Priya Anand's relationship with both women shifted in the months following the restructuring, evolving into something neither entirely comfortable nor entirely resolved, the way most real relationships do after a betrayal of trust, even an unintentional one rooted in fear rather than malice. She remained close to Elena, their friendship deepening if anything, strengthened by the honesty of the conversation that had finally surfaced years of unspoken tension. Her relationship with Margaret became something more distant and professionally cordial, neither woman quite able to return to the easier dynamic they had shared before Priya's silence had become, in hindsight, part of the machinery that allowed 18 months of quiet cruelty to continue unchecked. Priya thought often, during this period, about what she might have done differently, whether speaking up earlier, even at personal risk, might have changed the outcome for Elena, for Margaret, for the dozens of other employees who had watched the firing happen and learned, in that moment, exactly how little protection competence alone provided against someone determined to use positional power unfairly. She did not arrive at easy answers. She arrived, instead, at a harder, more useful understanding that silence rooted in genuine fear deserves more compassion than silence rooted in simple convenience, but that both, regardless of their origin, ultimately serve the same function, allowing harm to continue unchallenged. Richard Voss watched the entire situation resolve with a complicated mixture of relief and quiet regret. Relief that Elena had navigated an enormously difficult situation with more grace and restraint than the board had any right to expect. Regret that his own vote, years earlier, in favor of Margaret's hiring, had set in motion a chain of events that ultimately cost a talented executive 18 months of unnecessary humiliation before the truth finally surfaced. He found himself, in the months following the restructuring, paying closer attention than he had in years to the texture of how candidates discussed power and credit during interviews, a small, private correction he made to his own judgment that he never discussed explicitly with anyone else on the board, though Elena noticed the shift and appreciated it quietly. Margaret remained at Hale Logistics for slightly over a year in her reduced role before resigning entirely, a decision she made not in a single dramatic moment, but through the same slow accumulation of small realizations that had once built her resentment toward Elena in the first place. Except this time, the accumulation pointed toward an honest, if painful, conclusion: that she could not continue working inside a structure that daily reminded her of choices she now recognized, with genuine clarity, as her own greatest failure, rather than simply an unfortunate misunderstanding. She submitted her resignation in a brief, private conversation with the same director she had spent the previous year reporting to, a conversation notable, by every account, for its complete absence of the narrative management that had characterized so much of her earlier career. She did not request a public farewell. She did not frame her departure, even privately to her sister, as anything other than what it honestly was: the end of a chapter she now understood. She had built on a foundation of unexamined assumptions about her own worth relative to the people around her. Her departure was as quiet as Elena's restraint had been throughout the entire affair. A final, almost anticlimactic ending to a story that had begun with such deliberate public cruelty. Some endings refuse to give us the satisfaction we believe we are owed, and this was one of them. An ending that offered no dramatic confrontation, no final reckoning scene, simply the quiet departure of a woman who had finally run out of stories convincing enough to protect her from an honest accounting of her own choices. Elena continued running operations at Hale Logistics for years afterward, eventually stepping into a more visible leadership role within the broader holding structure as the company's needs evolved, though she never fully abandoned the careful discretion her father had taught her, choosing always to let her actual contributions speak before allowing her formal authority to do the talking. She maintained her friendship with Priya, mentored several younger employees with the same patient attention her father had once shown her, and rarely, if ever, told this story to anyone outside the small circle who had lived through it directly, believing, in keeping with everything she had been taught, that some lessons matter more when people arrive at them through their own observation, rather than through someone else's retelling. What this story leaves behind is not really a question about ownership structures or corporate governance, though those details shape how the events unfolded. The real question is simpler and considerably harder to answer honestly, for anyone willing to sit with it. How many times have any of us treated someone as though their silence meant they had nothing to offer, no power, no history, no claim to the respect we instinctively reserve only for people whose authority we can immediately see and measure? Elena Castillo spent 6 years being underestimated by deliberate design, a design she chose herself, but how many people are underestimated every single day without ever choosing it, without holding any hidden signature that might one day prove everyone around them wrong? Margaret Hale built her authority on assumptions she never once verified, and when those assumptions collapsed, they took everything with them, not because Elena demanded it, but because the truth, once exposed, made the previous version of the story impossible to sustain for anyone who valued their own integrity even slightly. The most expensive mistake of Margaret's professional life was never the firing itself. It was the 18 months before it, the slow accumulation of small cruelties built on a story about her own importance that she had never once stopped to question, a story she might have examined honestly at any point along the way, had she possessed the courage to look closely at her own reflection rather than at the people around her who made that reflection uncomfortable to face. Would you have spotted the warning signs if you had been standing on that floor? Would you have stayed silent the way Priya did, weighing your own security against a truth you only half understood? Or would you have said something, knowing it might cost you the safety of staying unnoticed? Tell us in the comments what you would have done in that room, and whether you believe Elena's restraint was true wisdom, or whether, in her position, you might have chosen a different kind of justice entirely. If this story affected you the way it has affected everyone who has heard it before, stay close, because the next story we have for you carries a reversal even harder to see coming. Subscribe now so you never miss the next chapter in these real stories of power, silence, and the people who are never quite who we assume them to be.